Welcome, everyone. You're welcome to our webinar today. Our topic today is Youth Understanding Consent During and After COVID-19. No always means no. So you're very welcome. This webinar today is being hosted by the Women Focus Canada, WFC. Women Focus Canada is a Canadian registered not-for-profit organization. The goal is to share best and promising practices that promote health and wellness for women, girls, families, and communities in Canada and beyond. Women Focus Canada's mandate include addressing gender-based violence and trauma, promoting physical, mental, and psychological health and gender rights and equality for girls and women, building capacity and empowering individuals to improve their lives and contribute to the social economic development of their communities. Right now, the project is targeting Afro-Caribbeans in the Greater Toronto area, and all the goals are to elevate community awareness, disseminate information, provide education about prevention, effects, and risk of COVID-19, and provide information on how to access critical services. So for more information about the Women Focus Canada, we invite you to visit the Women Focus website at womenfocuscanada.org. Women Focus Canada is partnering with the Canadian Red Cross Society for this project. So once again, I welcome you at this moment. Welcome you tonight. We got 4 speakers who will be facilitating this webinar. And we also have Rowena Power, who is our technical support person, doing a great job. And we have the president of the Women Focus Canada, Dr. Oluremi Adewale, tonight. So you're welcome. You're all welcome tonight for this webinar. And the goal of this webinar, again, is to discuss youth understanding consent during and after COVID-19. No always means no. So right now, we're just going to call our first speaker. Our first speaker is Karen Gwen. Karen Gwen is 17 years old. She's a facilitator and community educationist. So over to you, Karen.
So hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am very excited to be here today for Women Focus Canada and being able to really deliver a topic that I am so passionate about. So consent to me is definitely a topic that I think many youth tend to shy away from. So I want to be able to use my position and title as a youth and shed some light upon this topic in hopes that this will somehow create, start the conversation and create, I guess, a chain reaction among youth. So before I start, I do want to acknowledge that there might be information or data that you might disagree upon, which is definitely understandable. However, I think when it comes to a controversial topic like this, the way we approach things may vary. So I just wanted to put that out there. You are entitled to your own views and opinions, but this webinar is just to hear from a young person like me's personal place of being. So just a brief introduction about myself. So my name is Karen, and I am currently a gender-based violence facilitator and educator for girls with Women Focus Canada. Outside of this, I am a youth activist, and I particularly advocate against gender-based violence and oppressive practices. I tend to work with women and girls at different nonprofit organizations. Outside of the social justice realm, I am super involved with politics, including the justice system, as I sit on the City Youth Council of Toronto as an elected Ward 17 youth councillor and serve an executive position at the Federation of Canadian Secondary Students as an equity and inclusion officer. I also founded my own nonprofit organization to serve youth across Canada, and I am a 2020 Hurley Fellow. So that's just a little bit about myself. So some fun facts include that I am a violinist. I enjoy listening to podcasts, and I tend to delve deep into true crime documentaries and cases during some of my leisure time. So this presentation and workshop was actually designed by the Redwood. It's basically an abuse and violence prevention program called Peace It Out. Along with a partner, I spearheaded this initiative to develop, a peer-led curriculum to combat violence abuse through investigating peacemaking tools. We are about a group of 18 youth. So our mission includes, prevention programming is a workshop dedicated to recognizing aspects of healthy relationships early on with a main focus on consent. So our goal is for participants to leave with knowledge and a further understanding of what a positive and safe relationship should look like. So our vision is to help the young generation, and some of our values include equality, respect, autonomy, advocacy, safety, acknowledgement, accountability. So I also want to demonstrate, at least for me, I think consent and communication in many ways go hand in hand. Before we look into consent, we should definitely, study more about the types of communication and how that might look like in a relationship. So a good type of communication is assertive communication. So the definition is as follows: a type of communication that expresses information in a straightforward, honest, open, and confident way. So there are about generally 3 types of communication that we can categorize. So number 1 is passive communication. So this is the type of communication we see quite often. So when someone avoids, opening up to you or speaking up about their needs, feelings, or opinions, that is automatically passive. This is definitely ineffective and on the bad side of the spectrum, mainly because those who are passive are more likely to not know how to respond to dangerous situations or might, place themselves into a more anger-inducing situation. So assertive communication. This type of communication is the effective way of really to get yourself across to other people. So people who are assertive have a great sense of self, but also know how to make sure they don't obtain it not at the expense of others. So assertive people are able to weigh a decision based on considering both parties' needs. Lastly is aggressive communication. Basically, it's hostile and does this often at the expense of others. So some examples include, but are not limited to, violating someone's rights, physical and verbal abuse, etc. So no further explanation. This is ineffective. And there's some other types of communication, which include passive aggressive, but we'll not get into that. So this is just a visual or a Venn diagram showing that assertive communication is a combination of both your needs and others' needs. So it's mutual. So now this is a kind of activity that analyzes each type of scenarios in a relationship. The job here is that we need to explain why one scenario is a red flag or a green flag. In other words, are they acceptable or not? In doing so, we are able to decipher whether we should remove ourselves from the relationship or continue staying if you like. So I'm only going to go through 2. So the first scenario is, in a relationship, a partner always puts the other down and doesn't take accountability. For example, blaming the other partner for having a bad day, breaking something, or displacing their anger on them, even when it isn't their fault. So this would definitely be a sign of a red flag because this is gaslighting. I'm sure a lot of youth would know what this means, but just in case, a rough definition would be basically manipulating someone in a relationship, often the victim, to question their own sanity or reality. In this example, blaming the other person, or other words, displacing their anger onto that person for having a bad day, even when they weren't responsible for it. That is gaslighting. So scenario number 2, allowing each other to talk about what bothers them even if you agree to disagree, talking problems out peacefully instead of ignoring, yelling, and possibly getting violent. So no doubt this is a green flag. It shows that both parties are willing to accommodate even if they were to disagree. This is in many ways assertive. So now I would like to talk more about the concept of no means no, standing your ground. So the concept that no really means no, no exceptions, is actually rooted from a legal case called R.V. Ewanchuk. It basically says that implied consent is a myth in sexual assault cases, which is, a huge victory for women and girls. Implied consent basically means that consent is not expressively given by the person, but based on what that person feels or gets from implicit actions, words, or behavior. The worst part about implied consent, that sometimes a person's silence might be deemed as implied consent, which is obviously unconstitutional, and why there is the saying, your silence gives consent. So it is as simple as the word no, and if it's said, it must be respected. There is no additional requirement for the party to communicate their rejection if the word no was said. It is as simple as that. Again, consent has no restrictions, and such that there must be a time or place you have to say it. Saying no even during the event should be respected. So now I want to look into what a society with consent might look like. Again, the following examples are just a few situations where consent is upheld. So the first one is consent in healthcare. So consent to treatment, cure, or health visitation means a person must give permission before they receive any type of medical treatment, test, or examination. This can be a written paper form that you might fill out. Even though implied consent is considered, this is because if a person shows up for like a consultation, it is implied and assumed that they gave consent, but it should definitely be encouraged that a healthcare provider asks in person just for assurance. So consent in relationships. So consent is mutual, meaning that just because if one person does not consent and the other does, that is still not enough to do whatever the request is. Both parties must be comfortable, and this goes back to the idea of assertiveness. So, communicating yourself effectively while also respecting the other. Literally anything that is non-consensual is against the law and there can be severe punishments. So for the victim or survivor, the emotional and physical turmoil and consequences can cause even, lifelong permanent damages. So when you're looking for nonverbal communication, basically look for body language, such as if that person is pushing you away, if they're feeling uncomfortable, if they're fighting back, posture, facial expression, tone, eyes, etc. In terms of verbal communication, again, it is as simple as a yes or a no. Any outright rejections or agreements, it can be revealed in conversations, dialogues prior or during. So before I end my presentation, I would like to end off with a quote by Daniel H. Pink. So it basically says, autonomy is different from independence. It means acting with a choice. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that very informative session. Without further ado, I'll call on my next speaker, Victoria Fung. Victoria is also 17 years old in Toronto, and she's passionate about anti-racism and anti-oppression. Over to you, Victoria, you're welcome.
All right, so first up, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about sexual violence. So consent must always be asked for verbally and not just assumed or implied. It's very important to ask for consent because it not only shows respect towards yourself, but also towards your partner. And as Karen mentioned, it is required by law. Any sexual activity without consent is considered sexual violence. So what is sexual violence? Sexual violence is any sexual activity that is not obtained or given freely. Sexual violence impacts every community and affects people of all genders, sexual orientations, and ages. Anyone can experience or perpetrate sexual violence. Sexual violence takes on many different forms and includes, but is not limited to, sexual assault, rape, incest, sexual harassment, indecent exposure, cyber harassment, stalking, and degrading imagery. So sexual violence has devastating impacts on the lives of survivors, their families, and the well-being of society as a whole. So here's a statistic that I got from the Ontario government website. So it shows that 1 in 3 Canadian women experience sexual violence and 1 in 8 Canadian men experience sexual violence. So this really shows how prevalent sexual violence is in Canadian society, which is definitely very concerning. And also this information is as of 2020, so it is very recent. In order to help reduce the rates of sexual violence, it's really important to teach about consent. So before I talk a little bit more about consent, I thought I would go over a few statistics about Canadians and consent. This is all from Canadian Women's Foundation in 2015. So almost all Canadians at 96% believe that all sexual activities should be consensual, yet only 1 in 3 Canadians understand what it means to give consent. And while most Canadians at 97% believe consent is required between partners that just met or between in a casual date, 1 in 10 Canadians believe consent for sexual activity is not needed between long-term partners or spouses. And 1 in 5 Canadians between the ages of 18 to 34 believe if a woman sends an explicit photo through email or text, that this always means she is giving consent to a sexual activity. So once again, these statistics are very concerning because it shows that a lot of Canadians don't really understand what consent means. And of course, lack of consent and lack of knowledge about consent will lead to more sexual violence. So I have over here, this is a video about consent that's described through a cup of tea. So I'm just gonna play it.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No, thank you," then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they are unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea.
Okay, so hopefully you all learned something new with that. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few key facts about consent. So first of all, consent should never be implied or assumed. It is also not silence or the absence of no. It cannot be given if the
person is impaired by drugs and/or alcohol or is unconscious. It can never be obtained through threats or coercion. It can be withdrawn at any time. It cannot be given if the perpetrator abuses a power of trust, a position of power, trust, or authority. And it also cannot be given by anyone other than the person participating in the sexual activity. For instance, your parent or sibling or friend cannot consent on your behalf. So it's very important to respect everyone's decision when it comes to consent. If your partner says no to a particular sexual activity, they do not require an explanation as to why they said no. So now let's take a look at a few different ways to ask for consent. So you could say, would it be okay if I? Are you comfortable doing this? What do you like? I would like to do this. What do you think? Should I keep going? Is everything okay? And should we do something else? Remember that consent is an ongoing conversation. A person can consent at one point and then choose not to consent at another point, and that's totally okay. And also pay attention to body language, because even if someone does say yes, their body language can show that they are uncomfortable. For instance, physically resisting you by looking away or pushing away from you or closing their legs. So if you see any of these signs, then maybe it would be a good idea to ask for consent again. Consent is also more than a verbal yes or no. So some people don't say no to sexual activity because of the fear of saying no. So because of this, it's important to spot some signs that someone is not comfortable or someone does not consent. For instance, hesitation, complete silence, if someone says this doesn't feel right, or I'm not sure about this, or uncomfortable facial expressions. And once again, pay attention to body language. Is your partner just lying there in silence and not moving? So if you spot any of these signs, then once again, you should ask for consent. So here is a little graphic. This is from Algonquin College. So it just summarizes a few key points about consent. So consent is ongoing. Anyone can change their mind about what they're interested in doing at any time. It's also freely given, so you aren't pressuring someone or forcing someone. It's also specific to the sexual activity. It is also enthusiastic and informed, which means that you are not lying, tricking, or deceiving somebody. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting session we just had. Thank you. It's getting more and more interesting. Our next speaker is Asha. Asha is a project coordinator and community engagement manager at Aura Freedom. So I'm going to give it away now to Asha.
Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. Welcome on in. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Karen and Victoria for your amazing presentation. My name is Asha. My pronouns are she and her. And I am the project coordinator at Aura Freedom. So Aura Freedom is created in the name of gender equality. We are a grassroots women organization that works to eradicate gender-based violence and human trafficking through advocacy, education that advances equality. And that is the work that we do. And with the topic that we have today, which is on consent, I'm going to be talking about consent within the context of human trafficking, because a lot of the youth that we actually work with, like our survivors, didn't know the abuse was their fault because they always thought that they never said no to it. But we're going to be talking about how that was actually coercion and not really consent. But first, what I want to do is take us on a little journey on the grooming process and how does that work. And we're going to connect it back into consent. So this is the luring and grooming process of human trafficking. And we're going to start off here just at number one, at targeting a victim. Again, if folks, because this is going to be a little bit more of a heavier topic, if folks have questions, concerns, anything, please feel free to put that in the Q&A or in the chat box, and I'll be happy to unpack that as we go. So let's start off with targeting a victim. So traffickers target a victim, and this is where they find somebody who maybe has a vulnerability. This could be an insecurity. This could be targeting a person who may have family problems, having not a strong sense of a support group, meaning not having a support group from friends, from at school. Like there's something going on. There's a gap that is there. So that's how they target that person, where they may have even low self-confidence, things that we all experience in our everyday life. Then in stage number 2, we call this the collecting information. So this is where the trafficker is able to now get all that information from that person, like, oh, like, where do you live? Who's your family? What is the issues that you're having? Maybe are you having money issues? Who's in your household? Where do your parents work? Where do your siblings go to school? Literally just getting any kind of information that they can get from them, so that in stage 3, they start to fill in that need. And this begins with filling it in, whether that be money-wise, not having transportation to go to school or to go to work. So the trafficker is now this person who's taking you everywhere you need to go and providing you with literally everything you need. And up into this stage, we call it the honeymoon stage. There's no red flags. Everything is blissful. Everything looks so perfect. And it's literally like heaven sent, how we would call it. And then we get into stage 4, where now the trafficker begins to isolate the individual, where they're like, you know what, you don't need your family, you don't need your friends, you don't need any of them, because you have me in your life. And this really poses an issue, because at that point, the person's thinking, you know what, like, you've been there for me, like, I trust you, because again, there's been no red flags, there's no signs of abuse, everything is perfection. And this process can take a week, 2 weeks, 2 years. We've seen in some cases where now the isolation, where they begin to separate them from their family, their friends. Maybe they're saying, you don't have to go, don't go to school no more. Why go to school when you can be with me? And maybe we can make some money together, which leads into number 5. This is where the trafficker begins to claim that services must be repaid for. So that car, sorry, not that car, that shoes that the trafficker may have purchased, the food, maybe the clothing that they purchased, now the trafficker will be asking all that money back. Okay, I need that money back, or I'm going through tough times at this moment. So where now they put the person in the position to say, you know what, for you to be able to pay me back for the money that I've provided, it could be done through acts of sexual services. And this is where a person begins to get exploited and being trafficked. So the reason why we go through this process is because there was no consent during this entire process, because going through it, it was always blissful. And at number 4 and number 5, there was a lot of coercion, which we're going to speak about, where the trafficker was able to impose what they wanted to do, rather than the person really having the choice to say yes or to say no. They didn't even have the chance to say any of that. So let's go through, since we've Victoria and Karen spoke about it a little bit too, on consent. So I'll just quickly go through it through using the abbreviation of I Love Fries. So I Love Fries is the abbreviation that was created from Planned Parenthood, and it goes, what is consent? So consent is freely given, meaning you can give out consent, but you can also reverse it back. You can take back the consent that is there. Consent is also informed. So this is what consent is, and this is not what it is. It is enthusiastic. You can see it from your body language, from your gesture, not only verbally, and it is very specific. If you consent to one act, doesn't mean you consent to everything. So that is the big piece. And we love to use that for our youth because it's nice and easy to use and to remember. I love fries and remembering all those steps. So now let's get into the part I was talking about, coercion. And that is the big piece we really want to speak about. So coercion is manipulating someone until they give into sexual acts that they want you to do. It can involve blackmailing, pressuring, intimidating, threatening, or guilt tripping someone into doing a sexual act. And not giving consent on their own terms, on their own grounds, to feel safe enough to say, actually, I do not want to do this. And this is why we speak about consent and coercion a lot, especially. Again, so I was mentioning like many of our youth that we've supported didn't even realize that they've been trafficked until later or even after they've exited the situation, because most of our youth felt like they were at fault for the abuse and the exploitation because they never actually said no during this entire process, because again, there was no safe space to say that. The truth is that their exploitation was a slow process of coercion, manipulation, violence, and blackmail, and they never really had the choice. So this is why we speak on consent, but we can't only speak on consent without even, we have to dive into healthy relationships, because we need to have consent in the different relationships that we have, whether that be in our intimate relationships, family relationships, friends relationships. There needs to be consent there in these relationships. But what do these relationships look like? So when we're speaking to our youth, we explore the different major components of a healthy relationship. So let's dive into communication, being able to communicate, having boundaries. We express to our youth that it is okay to have your own separate boundaries, and we all have different boundaries. I may have a boundary that someone else has, and it may not be the same, but that is okay because that is my boundaries and that is perfectly fine. We also like to highlight that consent is absolutely necessary as a part of a healthy relationship. There needs to be consent while dating, even if you've been married for 20, 30 years, if you've been in a relationship for X amount of years, consent still has to be a major part of that relationship. If there is no consent, then that is a no-go. So let's get into the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship. And the reason why we explore this, because a lot of the times the youth that we've worked with, and even myself growing up, sometimes not even being taught what is a healthy relationship versus what is unhealthy. Rather, we learn what is a relationship through what we see maybe from home, from TV, from movies, or maybe even at school. So it's so important to be able to distinguish the two of a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship. So we explored the healthy relationship. Let's look into unhealthy. So let's start off with not communicating. So when problems arise, you fight and you don't discuss them. So this is an indication of an unhealthy relationship. There could be it's a disrespectful relationship where one or the other partner is not considerate of the other person's feelings or their personal boundaries, which we shared. Another is not trusting. So one partner doesn't believe what the other person says or feels entitled or invalid or entitled to invade their privacy, So an example we always give to our youth is, let's say that I was going to go to the mall and I let my partner know. I said, hey, I'm going to be going to the mall for like an hour. I'm going to be going out with these friends. I'll see you later in an hour. And maybe as soon as I leave, as soon as I leave, I get a text, like 50 text messages and 20 missed calls about where are you, what's going on, why aren't you answering my phone, That is a sign of an unhealthy relationship, because that really leaves a lot of room for that control because I already communicated that this is where I'm going to be going, this is what I'm going to be doing, and that there was no trust in what I was saying or what was going on. I just want to take a pause moment and look at the chat bar. If any folks have any questions or anything like that, please feel free. I know I'm spitting out a lot as I go, but we want to highlight as well that still to this date, the most common scenario that we see is an individual being trafficked by a man that they thought was their boyfriend. And this is exactly why education on consent and healthy relationships is so important, because it allows us to understand, okay, you know what, this is healthy and this is unhealthy at this moment. And especially going into, okay, this is what consent looked like, and this is actually coercion. I never consented to this. I never agreed to any of this. So this is why this is so important for us to explore. And we just want to amplify that just knowing the true meaning of consent can empower youth to recognize coercion and unhealthy relationships. They will also be more likely to seek help if they know what happened to them is not their fault. And that is the biggest thing we want to stress, that entirely, especially going back to looking at the grooming process, that was something that is super calculated and super structured, and that it is not the individual's fault at all. So that leads me to the end of my presentation, but before I go, I want to provide a resource on how you can get help, whether that be for yourself, a friend, a family member, even a stranger. This could really save a person's life. Here in the red is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can just take a picture, write that down. Even if you forget that, you can call 211 and ask for that hotline, and they can direct you to that. And the biggest thing that I really want to stress is like kindness really goes a long way, like practicing compassion, and really just speaking out on sexual harassment, gender equality, discrimination, and really empowering individuals' voices and supporting each other in ways that we can to really like tackle these different kind of situations. So again, thank you so much, and I'm gonna pass it off. But I want to thank you all for being here and listening to what I have to say. If folks are interested in presentations, we are currently taking presentations. I can leave my email in the chat box if you want to book presentations, maybe for your school, community center, different capacities. I would love, we have a youth group, we would love to come in and present. We have a whole presentation that really explores the root causes of human trafficking that would be super useful. But thank you all again. I'm going to pass it off.
Wow, thank you so much, Asha. That was that's taking it to another level. Thank you so much for tonight. I want to say thank you to all our presenters. And while Asha was speaking, we realized that it may be triggering some things, you know, in people who are watching, like if you're reacting, or you know, you feel this is a very sensitive topic, we realize that. And if you need some information, you know, as the information is being shared, if you feel that, you know, you need to talk to somebody, we encourage you to please check with your healthcare professional for support as needed. Asha has also shared some, you know, the hotline there. You could seek for support. Please do seek that support. Like she said, it's not your fault. If it has happened to you, it's not your fault. So right now we're going to the last lap for tonight's webinar. I'm kind of really anxious and see what the three people that I've spoken before have been very, very phenomenal. So I'm going to hand over right now to our next presenter, David Gazan. And guessing that David is a community engagement and projects manager at White Ribbon. He's in charge of facilitating workshops, trainings, and presentations for the Draw the Line initiative, as well as supporting other White Ribbon projects. So while not taking so much of your time, I'll hand it over to David.
First of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's great to hear from other presenters, Asha, Victoria, Karen. It's great to hear all the work that you're doing. It sounds great. And I think I just decided I want to start my presentation with a question. I want to ask everyone, folks who presented, participants, absolutely everyone. Why do you think it is important to engage men and boys in this conversation on consent and sexual violence prevention? Rowena says, because it takes two. Okay, everyone is affected, great. Anything else? Awesome, those are great answers. And men should be educated about consent to combat sexual assault, etc. That's excellent. Okay, great, thanks, Karen. It's important for boys and men to engage in consent because consent impacts everyone, and we need all genders to help prevent sexual assault. Okay, all genders should be involved here. Rape culture, okay, awesome. We might unpack that concept, although some folks already spoke about it. So this is the topic that I am precisely going to be speaking about. Just so you know, Dr. Remy called me. She said she needed like someone who was young to present. I said, well, I am older than Google, but I certainly work with a lot of youth, so I can come and present about my experiences working with young folks. I am 30, so I don't qualify into that group any longer, but I'm very happy to be here and share those experiences. So I'm going to start by talking about White Ribbon, what we do. Then I'm going to speak a bit about gender-based violence, and then I'm going to be talking about sexual violence prevention and consent specifically, and the work that we do to engage men and boys. So just so you know, some of you might not have heard of White Ribbon. We are an organization that was created in 1991 as a response to the Montreal massacre. In 1991, we were going to have the first day of remembrance of this event. And folks realized that women were taking part of this conversation, organizing the event, getting everything ready, discussing about how to prevent these events from happening ever again. And they realized as they were organizing this first day of remembrance that men were not taking part of the conversation. A lot of men were just like avoiding the conversation. It was mostly women who were talking about this. And unfortunately, they also knew that most violence against women was coming from men, and that the young guy who came into that college in Montreal and who shot those women, he was a guy, and he was specifically targeting women, right? So we started just as a response to these events, and with the goal of engaging young men, knowing that there will be no solution to gender-based violence if men don't take part in this conversation, not as leaders, not taking a leadership position necessarily, but listening and paying attention as allies as to what they can do to end gender-based violence. Now, something that I want to mention, and that completely applies to gender-based violence and also sexual violence and this conversation about consent, is that I found that working on this topic in Canada is really challenging. It can be really challenging. I am originally from Colombia, and when I say that I work in gender-based violence prevention, people usually ask me, oh, so you have some projects going on in Colombia, or do you work abroad, and so on, right? A lot of Canadians have a really hard time believing that gender-based violence is happening in their own communities, that it is happening in their own families, in their own schools, and so on, right? So it's something that I want to bring up because unfortunately it is happening around us. As Victoria, I think, mentioned, 1 in 3 women, Canadian women, experience some form of sexual violence throughout their lives. So it is likely that we know survivors. It is likely that we know victims. It is likely that we're surrounded by people who have been affected by this issue. So it is really important that we speak about it. So when we work with men and boys, we know that it is a difficult conversation. We know that it takes a lot of work in getting men to be part of this discussion and acknowledge a lot of the privileges that they live with, right? Like not having to be harassed in the streets, not walking around parking lots with their keys in their hands in order to defend themselves if they have to, if they were to be sexually assaulted, right? So as part of our approach, we use what we call a strength-based lens, which means that we are not going to work with them through shame. We're never going to come into a classroom, a session, pointing fingers at anyone, but rather we speak a lot about what each one of us can do in our personal lives to end gender-based violence. We speak about role modeling. We speak about the things that we say. We speak the things that we don't say, the things that we are complicit to, and we have a conversation about the role that we can all play about in ending gender-based violence. Now, something that I also wanted to run with you folks, and please feel free to jump into the chat box and share, is one of the activities that we tend to use in all of our workshops. This activity is called the Man Box. So this allows us to really discuss masculinity, to take a look at what are the expectations that we put on men, young boys, since they're very young, and really think about how those expectations are connected to gender-based violence and sexual violence. So another question for everyone. When you think about the messages that we send kids, the messages that we send young men, what do you think are some of those things that men have to be in order to be considered real men? What are those messages that we send young men that they have to be? So for instance, being strong, right? What are some other things that that you think society asks of men in how they behave, how they act. Men should not cry or show emotion. Great, thanks a lot, Victoria. So men are not allowed to show emotion, right? Anything else? That's great. Men need to make more money than their partners. Okay, so they have to be providers, right? And they have to be in control of the house. Great. Men have to be strong. Excellent. So this is usually what we get in this exercise, right? Some of you mentioned some of these traits, these characteristics. They usually involve having a very dominant attitude, being in control, being strong, not showing any emotions. And when we think about the concept of consent, which was really well unpacked by previous speakers, we see that when we are requesting for consent or negotiating consent or using it as a communication skill, just as Karen said, we really need to express our emotions. We really need to express our needs. There is no such thing as trying to be in control, right? We rather have to speak. We rather have to, as two people, more people, whatever the interaction is like, really decide on something that we are agreeing on, because that's what consent means, right? Agreeing on something and being able to in a what's the word, enthusiastic way, sorry, come to that, into that agreement. So in our work with men and boys, we really speak about this, and they need to challenge these expectations that we receive from the media, from our parents, from our families, and modify our behavior and really think about the things we say in a way that we're making each other better. So something that we really stress among young men is the importance of being a good role model. When we speak about men or about masculinity, we know as a fact that men tend to copy each other's behaviors. Men decide or establish what is permissible in a room, right? Or what is not, right? If somebody thinks that something is not too masculine, then they're likely to be bullied. They're likely to be harassed even, right? So we give young men permission to say, hey, that's not okay when they hear a sexist joke, or hey, that's not okay when they hear somebody making a comment about somebody's appearances or objectifying women, right? And in this way, we found that men are very willing to have conversations about sexual violence prevention. We know that this type of intervention that we call bystander intervention really works really well in the prevention of sexual violence, because unfortunately everyone has blind spots. Unfortunately, we've all been raised in what folks have mentioned, rape culture, in a culture that normalizes non-consensual activities, in a culture that normalizes pushing somebody to get consent. So when we ask young men to check on each other, to make sure that each one of them is doing the right thing, so that tends to work really well. So something that we use a lot are scenarios. For instance, we would bring some scenarios about somebody being drunk at a party, and then we ask young men, okay, what would you do, right? How will you make sure that this person is safe? How will you make sure that your friends are not going to take advantage of this person? What if somebody tries to do something? What would you do, right? So we speak about bystander intervention in this way. And we always put the responsibility on you as an individual. How are you going to make this space that you come into better? And how are you going to make the lives of everyone in your community and in your family, among your friends, a lot better? Something that we emphasize a lot on is the importance of intervening at a conversational level. As I mentioned before, something that we ask young men to not take for granted are comments or talk that is sexist, that discriminates against women, the 2S LGBTQ+ community, folks of trans experience, because we know that language normalizes behavior. We know that although often it might just seem like a joke, it might seem like a comment that doesn't really hurt anyone, at least physically, we know that we are enabling larger actions that cause greater harm when we don't challenge that behavior. So something that we often are going to request from young men is, if you hear somebody say something, even if it's just a little comment that is sexist, just tell them, hey, that's not cool, you know? Stop saying that. It's not going to work for you in your life. It's not going to work for me. So let's get rid of that, and let's become better together. So that's usually how we work with young men. And something else that we do is emphasizing the negative impacts that gender expectations bring on men, right? So I've spoken about how these traits in the man box often enable violence against women, against gender minorities. But we know that there is also a toll on men when they fully follow all those traits in that man box, right? We know that men are seeing themselves being more lonely, especially middle-aged men. We know that men tend to take less care of themselves. They tend to lose relationships. They tend to rely on substance abuse, and they tend to not access mental health resources when they need them because they think it is not masculine. So we also emphasize in that to bring the conversation forward on the importance of challenging gender norms. And I think my time is up, and so I'm happy to answer any questions. Just as a last PSA, we also have some wonderful projects going on with the post-secondary sector, colleges and universities. We have free workshops for you in case there are any faculty, staff, anyone who would be interested. Please let us know. I would be more than happy to give you more details. And yes, that's it for me. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful presentation. And to all our presenters today, you've done amazingly well. Absolutely, we need to have more of these types of conversations, especially from the angle that David is also working, and that's a great work, you know, bringing everybody together to talk about these issues. Before we wrap up, I would like to see if there are any questions in the question and answers or in the chat. Are there any questions there, Rowena?
So there was one that I saw earlier. There was somebody who asked, so specifically to Asha, about how they could learn more about your organization and the work that you do. I imagine that they're looking to have a presentation where they work.
Oh, thank you to that question. Definitely, you can follow us on our social media, so Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Aura Freedom. I'll put that in the chat box, and you can visit our website, www.aurafreedom.org, and I'll drop my email, which is asha@aurafreedom.org, to email me on like booking any presentations, or maybe even getting any more information about some of the things that I was talking about, maybe getting resources and things like that. I would love to share that. I'm going to drop it in the chat box. So
perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you have any more questions?
Actually, there's one that's specifically for David.
Right.
So David, if you wouldn't mind answering this one, I'm just going to unmute you if you could unmute yourself. So the question is, you know, like some of the statistics that you shared were, you know, a little bit depressing when it comes to this particular issue. And I just wanted to know, you know, have you seen an improvement in engaging with men over the years, considering that it's a tough topic to discuss?
For sure. And the context changes so much as well, right? I'm not sure. That's an interesting question because unfortunately we do not have data about changes in attitudes, let's say over decades, in male identifying individuals. Now, there is some hope because we definitely see a lot more people being part of the conversation, wanting to learn about privilege, wanting to learn about their own role in ending gender-based violence. At the same time, just in the last 10 years, we've seen a very abrupt rise in violence that is related to subcultures, online subcultures that are mostly of men, right? Like incels, red pillars, and everything that is known as the manosphere. So that's very worrisome. And we continue seeing more of those. So there is at least a group of men, which is significant in number, that is becoming radicalized online. And that's an area of concern for us.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. It's certainly something we see. You hear about it in the news, but you wonder just how significant it really is. So a follow-up question actually that relates to, how we engage with people. This one's for Asha. So how do you engage with youth on the subject of trafficking, particularly if people are not necessarily aware that they're being trafficked?
Thank you for that question. For our thing, so we have the HT Peer Prevention Project. So we are all youth who go into youth spaces, community centers, after school programs, schools when they were opened up, even though they are now, but pre-COVID. And we tailor our presentation to be youth friendly. So the language that we use, the body language, and just how we interact with the youth, we make it in a way where it's a conversation rather than a lecture. So we invite youth into the conversation and really play into everyday scenarios and everyday examples. So for example, in our presentation, we have some memes just to make it relevant. We have some like open-ended questions to ask folks like, what do you think about it? And really like validate their answers and what they have to say. And a lot of the times for the youth that we've worked with, they know a lot more than we assume that they do. They're so brilliant. Whenever we come into schools or community centers or shelters and talk about the conversations, they are ready to have that conversation and they're already eager to like take it there and they're not afraid of it. So I think the biggest thing is really having those open conversations that are safe to have and really creating that open environment for folks to feel like, okay, I can participate in this. And even though I may not know something about this, I'm ready to learn.
That's really encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you.
So a question for everyone actually is, how has this changed in the context of COVID? Has it had any impact on the work that you're doing and the nature of the work that you do?
I'll take that question. So for us, like I was saying prior to, like we usually go into schools. That was our main way of like presenting to youth or like going in person to shelters. And it's so much more different being in person because people can feel your energy. They can come to you and speak to you, and you can really have those more intimate moments. So that was something that really impacted us, not being able to be in person with youth. But what we started to do is we actually transitioned to online. So we do our presentations on Zoom, where we have like the chat box. Similarly, we use like polls to try to keep that same interaction going. And in every presentation, we actually have a trauma counselor with us for when we do have disclosure. So again, online, we still have the trauma counselor. So we have the same format in place, but it's a lot different and it has impacted youth a lot, especially we're seeing since a lot of everyone's at home, particularly youth who are doing school at home and things like that, where maybe the abuse is happening in their home. So we've seen like a rise in that and really trying to safety plan and figure out, okay, if home's not the safest place, what is it that we can do to ensure that safety happens? Because sometimes home isn't the safest place for a lot of folks. So that's a big thing as well.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. David, do you have anything to add to that in terms of your work?
Yes, for sure. On our end, it's also been challenging to adapt to online sessions. They're definitely not the same, although we do try to work with Zoom and all the technological features that are available nowadays to engage folks. But we're definitely not reaching as many. I think now there is going to be a big gap in knowledge about the topics that we always address, like gender-based violence, sexual violence prevention, and so on, right? And we know that many families are trapped by themselves for the first time ever, right? They're not used to negotiating relationships in the sense of who does what, how do we manage conflict, and so on, right? So there is a big worry on our end on the increase of gender-based violence, especially domestic violence, and also on young folks being targeted online because they're spending a lot more time on their devices. So we know there's an increase in them being targeted for human trafficking purposes or sexual violence.
Okay, okay.
I was going to ask for contacting. I know Asha has provided us for all the speakers that if they could please share their contact information, especially with me, because I think I'm going to, I want to know more about this topic. I do really want to know more about it. More so because I have contact with a lot of women and whose children may be, you know, going through this kind of situations and they don't even know how to handle it. So women parents need to know this, or, you know, so I would really want to push this and see how we can help, you know, spread this message even further. Yeah.
That's great. So since we haven't heard from Victoria or Karen yet, we know that you're a little younger than most of us on the panel. And so, you know, you're both really clearly very passionate about this issue and very knowledgeable as well. And yeah. I think people are probably wondering, like, how did you get to be so knowledgeable and so passionate about this topic so early in your career?
I can go first. So I think mostly it's lived experiences. In addition, you know, advocating for gender equality is pretty much a purpose-driven work that I commit to on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if I can give like a great explanation, but, you know, every time I hold up a banner, march in liberation, or confront bigotry and stand up for my moral beliefs, I truly believe that it comes from a place of understanding and belonging that is deeply entrenched to my identity. So in other words, true advocacy is best demonstrated as an act of resilience. So I'm really humbled by the experience of being surrounded by girls who continue to take on challenges and overcome setbacks to govern the way they feel, think, and act. That to me is a testament to our strength and resilience as youth advocates.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Victoria, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so to add on, for me, how I became really passionate about social justice was really the fact that growing up, I was one of the only people of color in an all-white school. And from there, I started to learn about intersectionality. And I also came across a lot of statistics about sexual violence. And I actually wrote an essay on sexual violence for my grade 9 culminating project because I was so passionate about it. And I honestly, like from there, I've just done a lot of research by myself because I'm really interested. And I think it's really important for youth to learn about consent because children really are our future and they will be role models for the next generation. And when we have more people talking about consent, then the topic isn't as like a big deal. Like it's something that's easy for people to talk about. So it kind of removes the stigma from saying no. So everyone's comfortable, which will eventually help to reduce the rates of sexual violence.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much. It's been so, we could go on and on and on and on this topic because it's a very, very relevant topic in times like this. Yeah, thank you so much. I really want to say thank you so much to Rowena. I've seen you in the past weeks, and I've seen how you've been supporting. It's so amazing. Thank you so much for your support, especially even for tonight. I want to say thank you. I want to say a very big thank you to the brain behind this whole, project, Dr. Mrs. Oluremi Adewale. We want to honor you. We want to really thank you for creating this platform for us to learn, to help and to create a better future for everyone. And last and not the least, I want to thank every presenter tonight, Karen, Victoria, Asha, and David. Thank you so much. You're so inspiring. Keep up the good work. And yes, I hope we get to meet you again and get to talk with you again on this same topic. Thank you, everyone.